Good evening and welcome to the October 23rd work session of the Ann Arbor City Council. Mr. Dohoney, I believe we have a presentation tonight on housing and homelessness. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yes, this is the special meeting that several of you asked for. You will recall we started out, it was going to be a session focusing solely on housing, and then homelessness was added some point after the fact, so we're combining them. I will remind you that we have to have a hard stop at 8:45 for public comment. You won't take that long, right? Nope. So we'll get to that before 8:45. This is also the fifth of our 5 straight meetings in a row. Limping as we are, we're here. Our next quasi work session will be December the 11th. And on the 11th, we're going to do the program that evening in 2 phases. So phase 1 will be city staff. And so you'll hear from John Fournier talking about the research we've been doing on economic development, customer service, that sort of thing. We'll also have Public Services talking about the water strategic plan that they've been working on, Mr. Steglitz and one of his associates. And then our esteemed clerk will be speaking to you about the preparation we are doing for the upcoming presidential election cycle. Be a lot of attention focused on that next year. We'll take a break and then we'll come back and then invite the University of Michigan to come to the podium to talk to you about the planning processes they are going through, laying out their vision for the next several years. Also touching upon things where there's some intersection points between the city and the university. So that'll be the evening on December the 11th. And then we will not have a work session again until probably sometime in February. And we'll come back to you with more information as it takes shape. So at this point, we'll bring up Jennifer Hall. Ms. Hall will talk about the housing portion, and then she will facilitate the rest of the presentation leading into homelessness. You want questions as you're going, or questions at the end, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and City Council members. I will be doing the bulk of the housing session. Amanda Carlisle with the Washington Housing Alliance will also be doing a presentation, and Dan Kelly, who is the Executive Director of the Shelter Association, is available for questions at the end as well. What I'm going to do is give a lot of background information, some of which you may have seen, but wanted to make sure that we all started at the same place and that it's information available to the public if they are also interested. And then I'm going to go into some really in-depth information about housing. And then Amanda's going to do her presentation, and hopefully we'll do the questions at the end. We hope to leave a good amount of time for that. So what's the definition of affordable housing? It is housing that most often is defined as paying less than 30% of your housing costs on your housing. It doesn't matter if you're an owner or a renter, and it doesn't matter what your income is, but obviously the lower your income is, the bigger the burden is. Once you pay 30% of your income, there's not a lot left over to pay the rest of your costs. One of the more newer definitions is to add in transportation. So a community like Ann Arbor, where it's very expensive, if you have to travel far, then you also have more transportation costs. So if you add the two together, if it exceeds 45% of your income, then it's considered cost burdened. Just a reminder, Ann Arbor primary statistical area includes all of Washtenaw County, and the median income, family median income in 2023 is $124,000. That's a significant increase. The last 2 years have both gone up significantly compared to in the past. The 60% AMI, which is highlighted, is most of the city's programs are targeted at 60% AMI. The DDAs at 50% AMI, vouchers also at 50%, but there's some other HUD programs that limit incomes to 80% AMI. And if you take this information, the only number that's real in here is the 124,000. The rest is a formula, regardless of the household size. That's just a formula for every other box you see. But if you take 30% of these incomes and you look at that as a housing cost, these are the housing costs that we, generally speaking, in the affordable housing world are trying not to exceed. So if you look at 60% AMI, you can work your way across from one person to a 5-person household to see what those maximum housing costs are. People are often surprised to see how high they are, but we have a very high income, and that is why. What is affordable housing? All of these are affordable housing. When you have any kind of restricted incomes, or you can have senior housing that doesn't have restricted incomes, but it's restricted by age. But you can also have naturally occurring housing in the marketplace, unlikely in Ann Arbor, but in other communities where there's no restrictions, but the housing is reasonably priced. To remind folks of the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, we own 20 different properties, and we have 564 apartments. We have a fairly large voucher program, over 2,000 vouchers. We also have a family self-sufficiency program where we help folks, they voluntarily can participate, and we help them to become self-sufficient. And we also have a homeownership program, which I think I just found out we have 18 homeowners right now. And the homeownership program is where your voucher, instead of paying your rent, it ends up paying your mortgage and taxes. Where is the Housing Commission's housing distributed? Here's a map. This isn't representative of every affordable housing project in the city, just the housing that the Housing Commission owns and manages, but it's pretty concentrated when you add in the co-ops, when you add in Avalon Housing, Michigan Ability Partners. The place where there is not very much affordable housing is actually mostly in Ward 2, somewhat in Ward 1 as well. This is a slide that Washtenaw County presented and let me borrow. This is showing all the housing units in the county from 2012 to 2021. In that time, the county gained 10,226 units. The bottom section, the light blue, is vacant housing units. The orange is rental. Then you have those with a mortgage and those without a mortgage. And the yellow line cutting through the blue line are the restricted affordable housing units. So those housing units that have a restriction up to 60% AMI and it's somehow deeded or some kind of agreement. So you can see there's actually fewer restricted affordable units than vacant. The affordable units represent a little bit less than 3% of all of the housing units in the county. When we look at our voucher program, voucher is called the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is intended to enable people to move into neighborhoods that they desire to move in, whether it's because of where they live or where their kids go to school or where they have a job, where there's services, where there's transit. But inevitably, what happens is folks end up mostly living in urban areas. And in our county, even though we're the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, most of our vouchers are actually utilized in the city of Ypsi and Ypsi Township because that is where there is affordable housing to be rented within the limited amount that a voucher can subsidize. So how are low-income residents impacted by this housing market? When you look at what's called fair market rents, which is a HUD terminology, and they calculate it every year, and it's based on the 40th percentile of all rental units in your housing market. They do not include newly constructed units within the last 2 years, and they do not include subsidized housing. And so this is a graph showing the increase over time for a 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom with fair market rents. And you can see a really high increase both from 22 to 23 as well as 20 to 21, over 10% increase. I'm going to show you this because I have a map I'd like to show you. So there's a federal poverty level, which is different and not related to the area median income because it's across the whole United States. And so for individual, that's 14,580, et cetera. This represents for our community about 20 to 25% of AMI. So in other communities, it might be 50% AMI or 40% AMI. And so when you look at a map of high poverty levels by census tract, this is what the map looks like. And what does that mean to have high poverty by census tract? If there's a poverty rate of 25% or more, or if more than half the households have incomes at 60% AMI or less. And so there's one thing you may notice about this map. If we were interactive, I'd let you ask questions about that. But it's somewhat obvious, which is the primary purple area in the center of the map is really the University of Michigan, in and around the University of Michigan, as well as when you look at Ypsilanti, there's an area around Washtenaw Community College and EMU. And so when you remove students from those maps, you can see in Ann Arbor, most of the people who are in poverty self-identified by the census. When somebody comes to your house and asks you in your household what your income is, and you say, I make $5,000 a year in my summer job, but I am a student, you are in poverty. So when I like to look at where our real low-income census tracts, I don't use poverty. I instead look at percent of households on public assistance. And so you can see that that removes most of those census tracts that are in around the University of Michigan. And it actually shows even more concentration on the east side of the county, primarily Ypsi City, Ypsi Township, parts of Superior Township. But when you look at the city of Ann Arbor, the area with the highest concentration is in and around Bryant School. There's a couple co-ops in that area and a couple affordable housing projects just north of that, as well as more co-ops in that corner of the city. On the far west side, that is the census tract that the Ann Arbor Housing Commission has a property, as well as Avalon, as well as Michigan Ability Partners, and there's another co-op. And on the northern side, that particular census tract is where, just blanked on the name, Parkway Meadows is, which is the largest subsidized housing area or project in the city. One of the major impacts, not just in Ann Arbor, but throughout the county, is the University of Michigan. You can see the city's enrollment at the top, Ann Arbor on the red, and then the University of Michigan's enrollment in the blue. And you can see a parallel track going up. This is just the showing the enrollment, and then it compares it to the on-campus housing that the university provides. And as the university grows, it's not just students that impact the community, it's everyone that the university hires that supports those students and administration. This is showing the major area employers. You can see the university is by far the largest employer, more than the next 20 employers. So it's an outsized impact on Ann Arbor, but it also impacts the rest of the county. The good news is, as you know, the university is about to build thousands of new dorms units for their students, which is wonderful. It's going to have a positive impact, I think, on the marketplace once they're able to do that. When you hear from your constituents about the traffic and they complain about adding housing in a particular neighborhood and the impact on traffic, most of the traffic is actually from people who don't actually live in the city. They're actually commuting into the city for their jobs, as opposed to people who live here and work here or live here and commute out of the city for their job. And we're hearing anecdotally from, and you probably are as well, from various employers who have a hard time hiring people because of the difficulty in the housing market. Back in 2020, we did a housing needs assessment. We only covered the area in the downtown that is west of State Street. So we were trying to avoid the highly concentrated student area and just concentrate on what is more of our downtown of the city. And this is what they found, thousands of demand for additional units in a variety of income ranges. We are actually applying for a HUD grant with the City Planning Department and the City of Ypsilanti. It's called a HUD Pro Grant, and it's to look at both regulatory barriers to affordable housing, as well as provide funding for infrastructure and development. And one of the things we'd like to do is update this needs assessment, but to cover the rest of the city. So if there's such a huge demand for affordable housing, why isn't the private sector building it? I've used this slide for probably 10 years, and it's worse now than it's ever been out in the marketplace as far as the expense of building. There's no way to do affordable housing without some kind of subsidy, whether that's low or no cost land, whether that's actual cash grants, whether that's low interest loans, or a combination of those. Just to understand what it means to do affordable housing versus market rate development, the costs are virtually the same. So unless we're getting free city land or reduced cost land, we are not paying any different than anybody else in the marketplace. Our architects don't charge us less. Our engineers don't charge us less. Our construction costs are the same. There's a little bit of differences in some of the soft costs, but virtually the costs are the same regardless of what type of housing you're building. The biggest difference is how you finance the housing itself. On the market rate side, this is a broad generalization. Roughly about 20% tends to be from equity, and then about 80% comes from a loan from your traditional lending institutions. The biggest source of financing for affordable housing is low-income housing tax credits, which is not a HUD program, it's an IRS program, and it's kind of flipped. Back when I first created this slide, about 60% of the funding for tax credit funded projects were roughly from tax credit equity, and then the rest was a loan. The lower your income target is, you can't take out as big of a loan, and so you have to get grants because your loan has to get paid back with rents, and your rents are restricted by the income you are targeting. What does that look like when you get to the operations? This is why you see more market rate than affordable housing built. It is, when you look at the rents have to pay back, has to pay for operations, which is actually a small part of the costs. If you look at those costs, I do have an increased cost on the affordable. We have higher regulatory burdens, and so we end up having more staffing. But the majority of a project's rent goes toward debt. So you have to take out a loan, you got to pay it back, just like if you have a mortgage for your house. And then the other big difference is taxes. The market rate units have to pay taxes. We have a $1 per unit pilot, and so we have virtually no taxes. And so that makes a big difference on the where your operating costs go to. One thing people tend to be surprised about is where subsidy comes from for affordable housing, as well as what is the largest source of subsidy for housing. If you look at the chart on the left from 2015, this is not a chart I created. It was created by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. They looked at all the federal subsidies that help homeowners and all the federal subsidies that help renters. And so you can see on the left, Primarily, that was mortgage interest deduction and real estate tax deduction. When President Trump changed the tax code and increased the standard deduction, that meant that many of us, including myself, instead of doing itemized deductions, I take a standard deduction, and so it's harder to track today what the homeowner subsidy is, because it's just lumped in as a standard deduction, and that's why I don't have a more updated number. But when you compare it in 2015 to the Section 8 low-income housing tax credit public housing programs that are for affordable housing on the rental side, it was less than half of that than the homeowner side. And that has been a long-term federal policy going back decades, that homeowners are much more subsidized than rental properties. When we do our developments, I mentioned low-income housing tax credits. Prior to the city's millage getting adopted, these were the funding sources that I had to go out and raise myself to redevelop all of our public housing when we changed it from public housing to project-based vouchers. So this is a typical, probably a little less typical than some communities, but typical in that you have a lot of different funding sources. Most communities do not provide general funds, like the city of Ann Arbor has generously done. Most communities don't have a DDA that provides funding. And so typically a community would use, or an affordable housing developer would use tax credits, they take out loans, they might have a HUD grant, which you can see is very tiny from the big picture, block grant funds, and other types of funding sources. Go ahead 3 years from when I created that last slide, and here we are with an actual project on the table that we are getting very close to closing on our financing. We still haven't secured 100% of these sources, but this is what the capital stack looks like. I've never had this many sources in any project before, and that's because the costs keep increasing. Supply side, lack of labor, increased interest rates, and so I'm having to raise more and more funds for the same project that I could have done for, 1/3 less or half as much 5 years ago. Thankfully, the city did adopt a affordable housing millage. Just as a reminder, that's what the ballot language looks like. And that is what's keeping my project afloat. Because if we didn't have that affordable housing millage, I do not know how I would get this project funded, frankly, with all those different funding sources. So what is the strategy for the affordable housing millage? Basically, what I do is I come up with a budget during the annual budget process. I make sure I look at the projects we have in the pipeline, and I also try to pay attention to other entities as well. I've been trying to figure out how to build in flexibility so we can acquire properties that might come on the market unexpectedly, such as the 16-unit acquisition that we did a year ago, not even a year ago, this year. It's hard, though, because if you don't know the owner and you don't have cash ready to compete with the private sector, it's very challenging to acquire properties. And we're in the process of working with the Housing and Human Services Advisory Board to come up with a application process for housing commission or a nonprofit and possibly for-profit entities that are doing affordable housing to be able to apply for funds. So where are the city's properties that we did an analysis on? Here is a map. The majority of them are in the downtown, but not all of them, which is why we did that housing needs assessment in the downtown area a couple years ago. Want to talk a little bit about some of the historical city policy successes for those who have not been around for 30 years like me. Looking at city-owned properties, that is a very big, significant policy initiative that the city took. Huge impact. Affordable housing millage, huge impact. Payment in lieu of taxes. We have the lowest I've ever seen in the United States. There might be others like us, I just haven't met them yet. Lots of different zoning changes over the years, and I know the City Council has been looking at increased density by right, increased density for affordable housing, transit-oriented development, density, et cetera. The DDA's financial support, there are others, either economic development or DDAs that do provide financial support, but not built into their budget like ours. Brownfield financing, brownfield grants, and very small, but it is there, reduced fees for planning and zoning. The current development challenges, we talked about cost of construction, high insurance rates. The city's codes are well known to be higher and more difficult to meet than other communities. There's city fees that are in excess of other communities. This is generic to any community, hyper-local community engagement and NIMBYism, and then all those funding sources that you saw for Catherine, they each have their own regulations. They each have their own ongoing and immediate regulations, whether that's on what the unit needs to look like, whether that's how you income certify a tenant, it can be very different, all kinds of different ongoing regulatory requirements. We even have different inspections. Right now I have 5 different inspectors for almost every one of my properties, only one of which is the city of Ann Arbor, and others come in and do annual physical inspections as well. Some of the operating challenges are insurance. We are seeing, just on one of our properties, Miller Manor, due to the fire we had a couple years ago, our insurance went from $50,000 a year to over $200,000 a year in 1 year. But our other insurance on our other properties are also escalating, just like everywhere in the United States. This is not unique to affordable housing. Utility costs are very unpredictable. The toxicity and prevalence of street drugs is very impactful on our residents. The lack of universal health care, very impactful on our residents as well. And I mentioned the regulatory environment. So my goal before I retire is to come up with a better development model. What would that look like? Trying to look at the regulatory burdens at the city. That's something I know others in the city are also interested in working on. Reducing that 12-layer capital stack to more like 2 to 3 funding sources, continued development of city-owned properties, and as you're aware, we're looking at how we could do bond financing with the millage backing the bond so that we can have more cash available at the front end and pay it back over time with the millage. And I don't have an answer yet on how that's best going to work, but that will be coming in December to City Council. Some of the common questions that I receive are, why are you doing new construction? Why don't you do acquisition? Isn't that cheaper? Well, it depends. Does it have an elevator? Are there accessible units? Do they have asbestos? Do they have lead-based paint? All kinds of questions come into looking at a property, not just do I have the money to actually acquire it. Other questions I get down are, get questions I get asked, isn't it more expensive in the downtown versus outside the downtown? Depends. Everything is property specific. Everything is dependent on what you're trying to build, how dense it is, how tall it is, and the downtown can be more expensive if you're building the exact same building outside the downtown, but that's typically not the case. So it depends, and that is where also where most of the city's properties are that we're looking at developing, and so it's available, and that makes it less expensive for us. I also get questions about including affordable units in market rate properties that are asking for additional density, and they trigger the affordable unit or cash contribution in lieu of units. My position has always been, or I shouldn't say it's always been, it's evolved over time, but most recently it is that contribution in lieu of units is more beneficial if you are looking at making sure that the units that are included are actually for low-income households. Unfortunately, most of our properties where that's been triggered in the city have been in and around the downtown or on campus. And so what happens is we end up having students that are in those units because they tend to be one-bedrooms as well. And if there was a way to guarantee that those were low-income household students that come from a low-income household, but we can't, we haven't been able to figure that out, then at least we'd know there's low-income students being assisted. But because I was telling you, most students are low-income, so you don't know that they actually have a need for those reduced-cost units. It's also hard for market-rate apartment owners they don't screen people in, they screen people out. And so we really want to meet the low-income needs of our community. We really need folks that do affordable housing, which is not only nonprofits. There's actually more for-profits that do affordable housing than nonprofits. Sad to say, but that is true. The other question I often get is, what's the difference between a development subsidy and a rent or an operating subsidy? When you have a development subsidy, when I was talking in the beginning about the development costs, when I get grant funding from other sources, they aren't guaranteeing my rent is subsidized as far as people paying 30% of their income on rent. The only way you can guarantee that is if you have a rent subsidy on top of your development subsidy. So if you have units in the marketplace through our zoning, for example, just because the rent is less than market rate, let's say it's $1,200, it doesn't mean that somebody living there is paying 30% of their income on rent. They could be paying 50% of their income on rent. If you don't have a rent subsidy, then you cannot guarantee it. This is my last slide. I just want to acknowledge that we have a lot of partners in the community that we either have contracts with or we have MOUs with that help us provide the wide range of services to our residents as well as our voucher tenants. And I probably need to update this now that I'm thinking about it. I will turn this over to Amanda Carlisle.
Good evening. Thank you all.
Before you get started,
Yeah.
Ms. Hall, do you want to take questions now, or do you want to, for your portion, or do you want to wait until? Okay, all right.
We have a lot of time for questions built into the presentation, just so you all know. Good evening. I'm Amanda Carlisle, the Executive Director of the Washtenaw Housing Alliance. Good to see many of you. For those that don't know, the Housing Alliance is a coalition of about 25 nonprofit and government partners that are providing services and housing to people who are experiencing homelessness or who are experiencing housing insecurity in Washtenaw County. And we do kind of homeless systems planning and coordination, kind of serving as that backbone organization. We provide training and technical assistance to our member organizations as well as others. We do landlord engagement and support, recognized need by our member organizations many years ago to get landlords engaged in the work to end homelessness, and also advocacy and public education work. And a little bit more about us, we fundraised the $8 million to build the Delana Center downtown in 2003. We advocated for Interfaith Hospitality Network to find a permanent home at St. Joe's or Trinity Health's Alpha House. We created the Blueprint to End Homelessness in partnership with the City of Ann Arbor, City of Ypsi, and Washtenaw County, and also worked on the city's affordable housing millage. On the screen here are some of our member organizations. So you'll see a broad range of organizations that are members of our coalition, including everything from street outreach providers, emergency shelter providers, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and agencies that maybe don't do homeless or housing specific activities, but they serve the population of people experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. Realizing this is a little small, so sorry, apologies for this. Just wanted to provide a little bit of history about the community's blueprint to end homelessness. So in 2000, the County Board of Commissioners created a resolution to look at three kind of phased approaches to addressing homelessness. The Delana Center was one, the movement to interfaith hospitality network to Alpha House was the second, and then the creation of the Blueprint and Homelessness in 2004 was the third kind of piece of the puzzle. In 2006, there was a task force that worked from the Blueprint, acknowledging that we needed to create 500 units of permanent supportive housing, so affordable housing coupled with permanent supportive services. And then in 2011, sorry, let me just see. Oh. In between 2006 and 2011, there was a task force that was created to understand not only how to build the units, but how to provide sustainable revenue source for the services. And the establishment of the Sister Evangeliste Fund Endowment was created out of that task force work at the county level. That was established by Trinity Health Ann Arbor, or St. Joe's at the time, in 2011 as commemoration for their 100-year anniversary in the community, and then it was matched by the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation. And that endowment now has about $8 million in it. The distribution out of that fund this year will be about $200,000 that will go for supportive services in permanent supportive housing. And then in 2011, we created an update to the Blueprint. We did some focus groups and provided some recommendations on how to address what was originally in the Blueprint. I will say, even today, with it being 20 years old, the Blueprint has an amazing wealth of information in it and a lot of research backed up for many years in kind of how to solve the issue of homelessness. And I think the trend that I've seen over time is that there are these sort of like investments that are made and then they're taken away. And so I'll give an example of one that's not an investment that you all probably made, but Michigan Prisoner Reentry Program was created and had like national success. And now what you see is that for our county, what we used to get in funding, that's now dispersed as part of what's called Offender Success to 9 counties in the state of Michigan in our kind of like local jurisdiction. So there was investment, it worked, but then the funding, you know, depending on a different administration at the state or whatnot, the funding was kind of pulled away. And so a lot of the work that is in the Blueprint and homelessness, I think, is still relevant. It's just a matter of resourcing it the right way. And then lastly, I did want to point to, in 2015, our county joined the Built for Zero initiative. So it's a international initiative specifically to end veteran and chronic homelessness. And it's led by the national nonprofit Community Solutions. And they've been really helping us to target our work around how we identify people experiencing homelessness, assess them. We have created a by name list of all of the folks experiencing homelessness in our community that we update very regularly in real time. And then we have a process whereby we make recommendations for homeless housing programs, you know, who is most acute and most in need of those resources. So building on that work we're continuing to do. And I'll kind of end the presentation with a little bit of a nod back to that slide. I did want to address the definitions that we use around homelessness, because I think sometimes that gets confusing. So category 1 is what's known as literally homeless. So it's someone experiencing homelessness on the streets or in emergency shelters. Category 2 is what we call kind of folks that maybe are losing their primary nighttime residence within 14 days. So they might benefit from eviction prevention assistance, for example. Category 3 is HUD does not allow us to use at this moment, and most communities are not allowed to use category 3, but it's other youth or families not in categories 1 or 2 who don't have a regular permanent housing option in the last 60 days. Typically, what I would reference would be these are folks that maybe are doubled up or couch surfing, don't have that kind of regular nighttime residence, but won't be losing their housing within 14 days, might not even have a lease, but are kind of just with family or friends or other folks. And then category 4 is survivors fleeing domestic violence who also cannot obtain permanent housing. One thing I wanted to stress is that this is the definition used by the federal government, HUD, and also our state government, specifically Michigan State Housing Development Authority, MISTA. But if you are to invest local dollars, there is more flexibility. So we could maybe, for example, in category 2, look to 21 days before someone is going to lose their nighttime residence. Jennifer wanted me to make sure that I included that, but just so you all know that we're, most of the funds that we have to administer in the homeless system of care are very specific to categories 1, mostly, and then category 2 and 4, not 3. So this slide just shows you kind of a continuum of the beds, the emergency shelter beds, as well as the permanent housing units that we have in our community and the agencies that provide those beds or units. So what I want to point out here is that you'll see on the right-hand side, we have a key that shows what population or subpopulation is being served by these different agencies. And they're also outlined if it's an agency that's serving maybe 2 of those populations. Most of our permanent supportive housing is dedicated to people experiencing chronic homelessness, and that's a very specific definition, and also a mandate that HUD has required of communities to look at those who have the longest histories of homelessness coupled with a disabling condition. Maybe it's physical health, mental health, substance use disorder. But most of our permanent supportive housing is dedicated to that population. And then you'll see on kind of our emergency shelter side, we've taken great care in the system of care to have agencies that have specialties and services that are specific to a certain population. And they are the ones that are providing, you know, that emergency shelter, maybe the temporary housing, maybe rapid rehousing. So examples would be Ozone House, really meeting the needs of individuals that are young people experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity. So you'll see kind of in purple, they're providing different levels of service. This slide shows you the homeless population at a point in time. That's the blue bar that you're seeing. And our point in time count is conducted each January during the last 10 days of January. The idea is that, this is HUD mandated, but the idea is that in colder climates like Michigan, that we will mostly find people indoors and we'll be able to get a better count of people experiencing homelessness. We do have teams that go out. I know some of you have participated over time during the point in time count to find folks on the streets, offer them shelter, offer them other resources that they need. And so that's going to happen again in January of 2024. But what you'll see is that we had kind of the most number of people experiencing homelessness at a point in time in 2014, and then a steep decline in 2015, and we have continued to see a decline for most years since then. Also, what you see in the red are the total sum of the emergency shelter beds that are in the community and temporary beds. And then you'll see that how they're broken out with family beds and family-only beds. One thing I did want to address is that in 2013, our community made a commitment with our HUD Continuum of Care dollars, which now is about $7 million that comes into the community for homeless assistance through HUD. In 2013, we made a commitment to really focus on permanent housing with those resources. So we reallocated, closed down some programs that maybe provided different types of services that weren't as effective as permanent housing, and we reinvested those. And so you'll see in 2015 was sort of the opening of some of those new programs. And one example of a program that you all are familiar with is the creation of Miller Manor's Permanent Supportive Housing Program was done with that reallocation of funding. We reallocated about 60% of our total HUD funds that year. So when someone is experiencing homelessness in the community, in the entire county, we have a process that's called coordinated entry, where folks can call one single number, that's HAWK 734-961-1999. They can call HAWK. They'll be scheduled for an assessment if they are determined to be at imminent risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness, and then they kind of get assessed and then placed on different lists waiting for housing or shelter in non-winter months. So we kind of have this like triage approach at the call center, and I did want to share, you all probably know, HAWK did transition its lead agency in October of 2022, so we are now basically 1 year into the new program. So OCED, the county's Department Office of Community and Economic Development, does the call center function. SOS Community Services provides eviction prevention assessments, as well as family shelter assessments. And then the Shelter Association of Washtenaw County provides individual assessments. Those are, again, to kind of have the agencies that are specializing in different services being able to provide some of those assessments. I think you all know that typically we have wait times for emergency shelter in non-winter months. And what folks are getting kind of in the meantime is typically an assessment. Hopefully, if they are experiencing street homelessness, they're getting hooked up with our PATH team through the county that's providing street outreach services. They can, get non-residential services at the Delanis Center, other types of services while they are waiting for shelter, and maybe even selected into housing straight from the streets. So between, this slide actually shows July 2022 to July 2023 data. And what I wanted to stress here was the increase in family homelessness starting kind of at November, December timeframe, and then really skyrocketing in February of this past year. A number of factors went into, I think, the dramatic rise in the increase, and one of them was the transition to HAWK. We didn't have, on day one of the transition, we didn't have the processes in place to make sure that family assessments were as smooth as possible. And at January or so, December, January, we had 5 to 6 week waiting list for family emergency shelter assessments. Unacceptable. The time is 48 hours. We're in our community standard for 48 hours from the time that someone calls the call center to the time that they get a family shelter assessment. But in the absence of having kind of that real time or close to real time assessments, the county responded by putting up an emergency hoteling program. And so we saw a big number of families and individuals within families accessing that family hoteling program in February of 2023. I think as of now, we have just about 20 or less families still in that hoteling program, and they are ramping down and getting, I think, I just heard about 12 of those households were pulled for housing choice vouchers, so hopefully we'll get housed really soon. The average length of time to housing also really jumped this year to 160 days, up from our average in 2022 at 109 days. Our goal is less than 90 days from the date of identification to the date that someone is rehoused. I did want to address, as a result of those kind of skyrocketing numbers of families, the Continuum of Care Board in April created a winter shelter task force. We've been meeting from May up until now, and we have a meeting later this week to prepare recommendations for winter sheltering during this upcoming winter season. It's already starting to get cold out, and we need to be able to have options for folks to go that'll be safe in Michigan's climate. And so the Shelter Association of Washtenaw County has really always taken on this effort with partners, but really they've led the effort for individuals, single adults experiencing homelessness. They have a robust plan in place this year that Dan can talk a little bit more later if you have questions. But at the kind of the height of the need last winter, on any given night, there was a demand for about 174 was the maximum number of individuals that the shelter had been serving. They're planning this year to have maximum capacity at between 199 to 204 people per night. So trying to anticipate a rise in the number of people that will be needing to access emergency shelter on any given night. On the family side, we have had less need over time for family expansion of shelter options for families in the winter months. We typically do not find families experiencing homelessness on the streets or during our point in time count. But last year was kind of the first year that we saw this real spike. So we've been having a lot of conversation about what it'll take to make sure that we can say yes to any family that needs emergency shelter during the winter months. The task force is preparing their recommendations. We're working to get those out. You all will get a copy of the recommendations when they do come out, but a preview of them, if you would like, is that we don't have any eviction prevention resources in the community again. And so we are looking for an investment in kind of upstream eviction prevention resources to make sure that families that can, we can prevent their eviction, that we can do that. We also, the county last year created what's called a shelter diversion pilot, where they provided stipends to families to have them not access the hoteling program. They provided $400 twice, so on average a family would get $800, and they had great success with the households that they served. About 58% never came back to the homeless system of care as of when we tracked that data last at the end of September. So we are hoping that we can do a shelter diversion program again, where we can provide stipends to families. And then SOS Community Services also recently got a state grant to provide shelter diversion resources as well. So we're going to try to pair that together. Diversion can be anything from you need a ticket on a bus or a train to get to a family or friend in another community. You need to go, we're gonna try to help you get back to a family in this community, but you might need to help paying for groceries so that they'll let you stay here. You can use those funds kind of any way that makes sense for the community, for the household to be able to provide or obtain, housing. It might not be permanent. I think that's one thing that folks kind of struggle with, is it might not be a permanent solution, but keeping them out of shelter while we can help them work on other issues is probably the best for them. And so we're trying to figure out ways that we can provide some level of resource so that maybe they can stay with family or friends while we're working on a more permanent solution with them. The last thing is that we are looking at potentially a rotating shelter for families, or ideally, we would love to have a place between January and the end of March that we can provide overflow emergency shelter. And so we are in discussions, but if you know of anyone or any place that is interested, we have an agency and some staffing support that is willing to do the work and be able to expand the shelter for families, but we don't yet have a site. And we're looking to between 25 and 30 families at a time that this site could accommodate. All right, the last part of the presentation is that I wanted to share our gaps and needs analysis with you all that was conducted by the Corporation for Supportive Housing. This is, it models and analyzes our emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing resources in the community. And so the resources that were considered also included diversion and prevention, the temporary interventions like shelter, rapid rehousing, and then permanent supportive housing. This chart is a little bit wonky, but it basically shows what our resource gap is for permanent housing based on what we have in the system, the existing resources, and what CSH determined as our annualized need. To save you from this chart, I'll show you, this is the summary, that we need about 886 slots of rapid rehousing, which is, I guess I didn't explain, rapid rehousing is a short to medium term intervention where we provide some level of rental assistance and services that are coupled, and it can be anywhere from 6 months to, 12, sometimes 18 months of assistance, even 24, depending on the funding source. Permanent supportive housing needs were identified as we needed 871 units of permanent supportive housing. As you know, this is a long-term housing resource coupled with supportive services for our most in need folks, most vulnerable folks. And then we needed 284 slots of diversion or prevention, which was what I was just sharing a little bit before, that sort of couples mediation with financial assistance. In terms of our temporary housing needs, we similarly have a gap. This is our base population and the folks that were needing temporary assistance. The resource gap, you'll see pretty much in parentheses that's showing a deficit. And then the takeaway is that we need about 58 emergency shelter or temporary housing interventions that are needed for adults, and then 123 emergency shelter temporary housing interventions are needed for families. The one area that I did want to highlight for you all, a good success story or a news story, if you will, is on this chart, you'll see 35 veterans, adult-only beds, and you'll see it's not in parentheses showing a deficit, it's actually showing a surplus. So when the folks at CSH looked at this, they looked at our temporary housing for veterans. We have a couple of different programs. They're called grant per diem programs. They're funded through the VA. And Michigan Ability Partners and Salvation Army are the two agencies that provide those services. And they looked at that existing stock as well as some beds at the Shelter Association, the Delana Center, and they said, hey, we have found that you all are underutilizing this resource in this community. And it's very intentional why that is, because over the last 12 years or so, at the federal level, at the state level, even at the local level, there's been deep investment in veteran homelessness. It started with the Obama administration declaring they wanted to see an end to veteran homelessness, and then they really resourced that work. So we have resources to prevent evictions. When I said we don't have any eviction resources, I should say we have some for veterans. But we have robust eviction prevention resources for veterans that prevents our veterans from experiencing homelessness whenever possible. And then HUD has really invested in the program called HUD VASH, which the Ann Arbor Housing Commission supports in doing the housing choice voucher part of the program, and the VA provides services. And the HUD VASH program is basically permanent supportive housing for veterans, and the federal government has really robustly funded VASH so that we have a pipeline, we have a continuum of care for veterans. We do have the kind of when someone is experiencing a crisis and needs emergency shelter, we have that available, or we have temporary housing available, but we also have those permanent housing resources that are available. So this is a good news story because it's working well in our system, and it's a proof point for all types of homelessness, that if we are able to resource, the prevention side and the housing side, that we really can find a way to get out of kind of the crisis mode, the emergency shelter needs that are there. And I look to this as an opportunity to say, hey, in our community, if we are able to fund these other points at other sides, different sides of the system, we might not need to as much emergency shelter as what that report says, because we can more robustly have resources for folks at either end of the spectrum. And this is our data kind of is demonstrated across the nation. Over the last decade, there's been a cut in veteran homelessness by 50%. It's incredible. And, it really is an opportunity to say, hey, we know what works. We have the resources for veterans experiencing homelessness. It doesn't mean that a crisis or an episode of homelessness will never happen for a veteran. It just means that we're quick to respond and we can get them rehoused as quickly as possible. And today, our data is that on average, it takes our community 86 days to house a veteran from the point at which they are identified as homeless to the point that they are housed. So with that, I'm going to stop, and you all can ask questions.
Do we have questions for our presenters?
I'm going to invite Dan Kelly up here as well, and the three of us will stay up here.
Councilmember Song.
So I really appreciate the pit count, because that was a question I think some of us have raised before. And it's interesting, the timing is in January. We've heard a lot about the worry about families, increase in families in being evicted. And I appreciate council had voted for that budget amendment back in March to help with that effort. I guess my question for you is that as we approach the next budget and anticipate another increase, right, in more families being unhoused, how could we budget for that? And I'm trying to understand the timeliness of that too, right? So if we go into budgeting in May, June, that's so far past your January pick count. Should we be thinking about another budget amendment? I mean, you're here talking to us, but we also know that our partners at the county are also responsible for this work too. So for me, I'm just trying to figure out the timing of how we can be responsive to these emergency situations. Know they're emergency, but then we also know what factors contribute to homelessness, right? And here we can only manage the budget and encourage our partners at the county and state level to do better, to do more. But I guess my question for you is, what would you present to us, so that we can better understand or budget for this? Maybe anticipation of the next pick count in January 2025, then, if that's what we have to think about now.
Yeah. I think the intent of the Winter Shelter Task Force this year is to come up with a plan, not just for this winter, but into future winters, so that you could maybe use that, those recommendations for future budgeting in, next spring for the following winter. And I will say, we're hoping that this report would be done by the end of August. It's just taking more time to understand. And the biggest hurdle is we are reliant on community, congregations, other places that might have a site available for us to find. And then we'll use this winter as, testing for, does this work, does this not? Just as kind of the hoteling and the stipends were kind of tested last year, kind of mid-crisis. So I would say, look to those recommendations as your guide for kind of like next spring. There are gaps in this year if there is a budget amendment possible. Dan's team is going to fundraise about $200,000 on their side of things for the gaps in kind of rotating shelter for individuals and other things. I don't know if you want to talk any about that.
Yeah, so we've got, just to get to our winter shelter budget, to get to that, we talked about earlier, trying to have 200, thanks for having me, by the way, sorry. Try to get to 200 people on a given night, which we anticipate could be the increase based on last year's increase. We have to add another site. We're adding this winter. We had it for part of the winter last year. It's cost intensive to have another site to go up to 200 people on a given night. We'll have 4 or 5 sites at a given time between daytime and nighttime. And so, as Amanda said, it's a $200,000 gap that we're fundraising. We're going to do a push for that at the Shelter Association. And that's particularly because if you look at the whole system need, you've got this huge need for eviction prevention and diversion on the family's end. And really what it ultimately comes down to, and the recommendations we'll dive into the details, is there's a need for funding in these areas, and then time to build capacity with the providers, and then honestly sites. One of our biggest problems right now is sites, because as Amanda mentioned, we're relying on congregations and things like that. So that's another lever that if any of our partners can pull, whether it's Ann Arbor, Ypsi, county, congregational partners, we're always open to that, because I think that's going to help a lot. And we're trying to get out there and find new sites. We're still working on it actively right now.
I will just say one more thing related to that is that Dan and I did do a presentation to County Board of Commissioners at their working session last Wednesday, all about winter shelter and planning and some of the gaps. So if you're curious, we also have a PowerPoint slide deck we can give to you all.
Thank you so much for being here and for all the work that you do on a daily basis as well. If you could just speak a little more specifically for anybody who might be listening around what the site needs or that you're looking for that winter site.
So on the individuals end, our site needs are, and we presented this at the commissioners meeting on Wednesday, we still have, so we run, like I said, multiple sites across the county just to meet the need, because you can't meet it at the Delana Center. We turn the entire building into a shelter in the winter. We convert the cafeteria, every space, usable space. So we have different sites. One is our rotating model, which is 22 partner congregations. We're 4 congregations short, pretty much 3 weeks in February and then the very end of March. Those weeks are all open. So we're looking for congregational partners, or honestly, we can get creative. I mean, if it's a non-congregational partner, we're open to exploring that too. I know during the pandemic, we even at one point took over the LRC, the county training building, and turned that into a shelter. So that's another need. And then probably the biggest need on the individual's end, which is very urgent, is that, as I mentioned, last year we launched a pilot site in Ypsilanti, which is great. We're partnering with the city of Ypsilanti again on this. I just presented before them last week as well, and they're very excited about this overnight partnership. However, the congregation we're partnering with can only do 4 nights out of the week, because they have weekend programming. They're a smaller congregation. It's St. Luke's in downtown Ypsi. Big shout out to them for doing that. However, we're missing those 3 nights, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We're talking actively with congregational partners, and we just need a site as close to St. Luke's as we can get, hopefully in Ypsilanti, so that we have a site out there 7 nights a week. That way people that are experiencing homelessness in Ypsilanti can easily access a shelter site. So those are probably the 2 big ones on the individual end, and then Amanda can share on the families end.
On the families end, we're looking for a site, I'll just say, because we're not greedy, between 15 and 30 families that they could support at any given night. Ideally, kind of, January through March is what we're looking for, but we are also modeling it after a potential to do rotating shelters so that it could go to different congregations. But ideally, it would, have some areas for children, also some bathing facilities, although we might get bathing from the Fed Up Ministries shower truck, and laundry from them as well, and a place for meals. So, yeah.
Thanks, that's helpful. And then to speak a little bit more about sort of needs or, how we assess progress. Obviously, you spoke to what qualifies as low income, what qualifies as, different levels of homelessness and need. If you could just speak, Ms. Hull, around, I know we've had conversations around this, but I just think it's important to discuss kind of the Ann Arbor Housing Commission's service area and kind of what's the catchment area that the Ann Arbor Housing Commission is serving. And then you didn't necessarily have that in there, but you may have it in your head, kind of an estimate around where primarily where folks are on the wait list in terms of zip codes and areas of need.
Thanks for asking that. I wrote a note to myself, talk about wait lists, I forgot. The Ann Arbor Housing Commission, our voucher area is Washtenaw County and Monroe County. As a housing commission, as a developer of housing, we can do housing anywhere. It's just our voucher area has to be approved by HUD so that there aren't too much overlap with other communities. And just so folks know, MISTA has vouchers in Washtenaw County, Plymouth Housing Commission, I think Taylor Housing Commission. So there's other areas that there's vouchers in the community. Our wait list, last time we opened it, I showed you the chart. We have, I think, 6 or 7 different kinds of vouchers. Our main voucher program and our project-based vouchers on the housing we own. We opened up our wait list in November of 2020. We had a little over 4,000 applications for our voucher wait list and a little over 3,000 for our project-based voucher wait list. We have 3 preferences, and so that, these are national, these are published. When anybody opens up their wait list, there are organizations that track and publish this nationally, and so we're a national program, so people can apply all over the United States. But we have a preference for residents, so if you live or work in Washtenaw or Monroe County, you have a preference. So that helps people screen themselves out so that they know they're not going to come to the top of the wait list. We have a preference for any household member with a disability. They go up to the top of the wait list. And we have a limited preference for households that are homeless. We work directly with the Continuum of Care and the organizations that do the housing access to have a certain number. Right now, about 40% of our units house homeless households at the time when they first became residents. And then I think it's more like 15 or 20% of our vouchers, people were homeless at time of admittance. So 3 years ago we opened, we currently have over 3,000 people still left on our voucher wait list, and we have over almost 3,000. We didn't go down very far on the housing that we own and manage. I think we're at 2,500. We do have a couple wait lists that are generally, we continue to add people if they meet special requirements. So people continue to call. We get about 1,000 calls a year, emails and phone calls for people looking for housing, and most of them don't qualify for our tiny little open wait list. We have to turn them away.
So do you know, since we're serving more than Ann Arbor with this wait list, what percentage of the individuals who are on the wait list are city residents?
I don't know the exact number, but it's small because there's so few people can afford to live in Ann Arbor who are low income. They're already not living in Ann Arbor. So when we open up our wait list, the Washtenaw County folks on the wait list tend to be outside of the city limits, more likely to be Ypsi City, Ypsi Township than City of Ann Arbor.
Councilmember Gaziad.
Thank you. This was really informative, so thank you all for being here tonight. So you were just saying that although, you know, there's a small minority of folks that actually live in Ann Arbor, that's not to say that many of them may work in Ann Arbor, correct?
Correct.
So they just can't afford to live here, but
That's correct.
they are
Yep.
contributing to the
Yep,
economy.
thank you.
I wanted to ask something around disability, which I know that you and I have talked a lot about, and prioritizing people with a disability. And can you share a little bit about how you match folks to units that are accessible? Yeah, that would be great.
So 2 parts of that. When I say we have a preference, so people self-identify when they apply that they or someone else in their family has a disability, and it can be all kinds of disability. It doesn't mean you have a need for some kind of physical accessibility. It can be other kinds of disability. Once you're pulled off the wait list, people who have a disability and residents or workers in the community go to the top of the wait list. And so once you're pulled off, we have to verify whatever it is. So if you say you had a disability and you really don't have anyone in your family, you go back on the wait list. If you're pulled for housing that we own, we find out from your family what your needs are, not just who's in your household, ages, gender of your kids, or different members of your household, but also does anybody have any special needs? And so then we have to match you up. Like if we have a 3-bedroom open, we pull you off our 3-bedroom wait list. If you end up needing some kind of physical accessibility, hopefully that unit does. Since when we did our RAD conversions, one of the reasons we did a lot of demo and new construction is because the condition of the buildings, but also when we built new, we added a large number of physical accessible units with no step entries, with first floor bedrooms, first floor bathrooms, so that we had a larger number of different units that meet that. So if we don't have a unit in your bedroom size that has your needs, we can either make modifications if it's possible, sometimes it's not, or we look to see if we have any units that meet your specifications, that somebody is living there that doesn't need that unit, whatever that accessible feature is. And so from HUD's perspective, we have to actually relocate a family who doesn't need an accessible unit, whatever that accessibility is, in order to put somebody in who does need it, and we actually have to pay for the movement of that family to go to a new unit. So we track it for ourselves. On the voucher side, we do not have a list of what's available in the community and what kind of accessible features are available in the community.
And I know that you and I have talked a little bit about Detroit Home Connect, which is the website that the city of Detroit has helped to fund and publish, that has all their affordable units listed. It has units in the private sector. I don't know if you both are familiar. Then it has features around accessibility. And I know that the list being public has been really helpful to housing providers. And when I recently spoke on a panel, there were housing providers there that were talking about, could there be such a list here? Could you talk a little bit about tracking that information and whether making it public is a possibility?
The difficulty is getting landlords to share that information. And so as the city of Ann Arbor, we have our own rental inspection program. So I think the easiest way to find out what's in Ann Arbor is through our own rental inspection program. But as I said earlier, most of our vouchers are not actually utilized in the city of Ann Arbor, so it's more challenging to get voluntary information. Other communities, some other communities also have rental inspection programs. So I believe City of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti Township, and does Pittsfield Township too? So most of them do. So if we could partner with them to figure out how to get that information. The question is, how do you, somebody has to gather it, someone has to enter it, and someone has to update it. And so like that, we don't have the staffing for, but if that was available and it was available to the community, it would definitely be beneficial to folks who are looking, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Councilmember Song.
I think we can recognize that our public schools participate in schools of choice, so we know non-residents are benefiting, are probably on the wait list because their kids are coming in from schools of choice, right? So Amanda, you work with families. I know the McKinney-Vento Act is a federal provisions for homeless families to provide for transportation to public schools. Can you kind of speak to how our public schools works within this continuum of care, even though they're not residents, and how it impacts?
I'm going to let Amanda speak, but just as an aside, McKinney-Vento is the act that pays for continuum of care funds as well.
Okay.
Passed on my birthday, July 22nd. But in 1987, so not my year. But yeah, so we have, so the Washtenaw Intermediate School District kind of oversees what's called the Homeless Youth Project. And they also have connections with all of the McKinney-Vento liaisons in different schools throughout the community. Oftentimes, the McKinney-Vento liaison might be the school secretary, might not always be a school social worker. So there's various levels of resource, and time that's made to helping homeless families. But in Ann Arbor, AAPS, they have a coordinator, as does Ypsi Community Schools that has a coordinator as well. And so those folks are part of the continuum of care and different committees that we work on, especially coordinated entry when we're thinking about families that, how are they accessing the different services that might be available to them. So they are integrated. I think we can always do a better job of that, but they are integrated into the continuum of care, and so that we can kind of hear from them about what the needs are for individuals and families. And then I'll also say we have kind of a bi-weekly meeting where we look at the, by name list of all of our families that are experiencing homelessness with community partners. They're definitely the housing providers there, but we also have DHHS there. They can help us with, CPS prevention cases. Maybe there's resources that we can have. And so there's a lot of work to be done, or that is being done within those meetings around kind of case conferencing family situations and finding the best, a housing option for those families.
Okay, I appreciate it. I have like 3 more questions, if that's okay. So, yeah, okay. So one, so I bring a copy of the Washington Affordability and Economic Equity Analysis from 2015 with me at all times, just in case. Should I meet anyone who's curious about the 2015 recommendations, which included at that time, rezoning, inclusionary zoning, incentive-based zoning as being high-impact policy decisions that we can make to increase equity and accessibility to housing, education, skills at that time. And I like how we pretend when we have our zoning discussions like this is all new and revolutionary, but it's been decades that we've talked about this. So I guess my question for you is, when will that be updated? And is that from the county? Because things have changed from 2015 a little bit, right, with the pandemic. And if it is being updated, could we also get data or information how ARPA money has impacted? I mean, we're just getting into inclusionary zoning, right? But at the same time, it'd be interesting to see how ARPA money has impacted our housing work and the federal monies, right? Or federal programs like eviction moratorium in this analysis. Is that on your wish list too? Is it just me imagining that this will happen in this?
Yeah, the
Okay.
Housing Alliance wish list, yes.
Yeah, it's on our wish list as well. That grant that I mentioned earlier that we're applying for with the City of Ypsilanti, that's one of the items that we have on our grant application to update. I don't know if the county has it on their to-do list.
We have asked the county to do that.
I don't know.
Okay.
And what was I'm sorry, what was your second part of that question? Oh, ARPA dollars.
Yeah.
Oh, including that, yeah. I think
In the
that's-
analysis. And then my other question is, so can you speak to the DDA's role in our work in providing more housing units before the affordable housing millage, and then the investments that they've made after the millage has passed?
So for those who don't know, the DDA, I forget what year it was, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was written into their, I think it was something negotiated, but with City Council, to put $300,000 a year into an affordable housing fund, and that increases, I forget what the formula is, but it increases every year. This year, it's like $370,000 or $80,000. The vast majority of the years previous to that, they used the funds, a lot of it went to the Ann Arbor Housing Commission when we redeveloped our properties under the RAD conversion program. I want to say, I forget, my slide was on there somewhere, it was like over a couple $1 million. The money can only be used within the DDA district, or I just blanked on what it's a quarter mile, thank you. A quarter mile within outside of the boundaries of the DDA district. So for us, that just touches Miller Manor, for example, and just touches Lurie Terrace. And I know Avalon has received funding to renovate they have 3 or 4 properties in and around the downtown. Since then, though, even since the millage, the DDA spent less than $1 million, more than $700,000 to upgrade the water infrastructure that was needed to support Catherine Street. And so while they were doing other work and they were moving the bike lane, they also put in and upgraded the infrastructure. That's huge, huge. That can be millions of dollars depending on where the site is, whether you have to upgrade sewer, water. They've also put in funding for what's going to happen above ground, so sidewalks and trees and things like that. They've also allocated, I want to say it's about $2 million toward infrastructure at 350 South Fifth as well. So that's in addition to that annual Affordable Housing Fund. The infrastructure funding comes out of their TIF funding that they get.
Okay.
So very big.
So my last question is, if we were to meet with the head of MISTA, or say some of us are on the Policy Action Committee here, so myself, council members Watson, Harrison, Iyer, Radina, what would you like us to tell them? How could we improve this process? Is it really the issue of timing on funding being released, the application process itself? What are ways of improvement that we can advocate for?
I'll talk about the housing side, which is a different part of MISTA than the homelessness side. And I've had this conversation actually with the new director, Amy Hovey. MISTA is mired in centuries past that doesn't work for the current situation people are in. Some of the things that they have, I'm a bureaucrat. We like to layer bureaucracy on top of bureaucracy that's not always needed because you're trying to solve a tiny little problem, and so you create layers of difficulties achieving things. So some of the things that they do is if you use certain types of funds, in addition to not 9% tax credit financing, but other kinds of funds that MISTA has, it's like gap financing. They have design guidelines that you have to follow. They're very much geared toward walk-up, suburban, 3-story apartment buildings. They have very high parking requirements. They have minimum unit sizes. They have requirements that don't fit like an urban downtown. And like I said, I talked to the director, she's aware of it, and she's hearing that from other developers as well. They also have very restrictive and expensive financing if you want to do bond financing with them, which is why we are unable to utilize their bond financing, which is why I keep coming back locally. Well, how can we do this locally? Those are two big issues, which I've also talked to their bond counsel and many people that work there. It's just a very big bureaucracy that's very slow moving, but those are issues that are affecting development.
Councilmember Dish.
Can I just add on to that
Yeah.
for homeless? So one additional thing that I think would be really beneficial is MISTA outsources its housing choice voucher management to private entities. And they do a great thing. They prioritize their vouchers for people experiencing homelessness. But oftentimes when folks are in crisis, they need additional assistance to help them through the voucher process. And by outsourcing to entities that are not within our county, that are private entities, sometimes folks have to then go through an appeal process because they were denied their voucher or it took too long. And so that is just one thing that we are doing some advocacy on, is to see if the MISTA could bring that work in-house again and be able to serve the clients that are receiving housing choice vouchers in a better way.
Councilmember Dish.
Thank you. Thanks for these presentations. It's really, I'm madly taking notes and kicking myself for even feeling tempted to feel overwhelmed because I'm not doing the work you guys are. But so I have two questions, and one is for Ms. Hall, and one is, I think, either Mr. Kelly or Ms. Carlisle, either of you. So Ms. Hall, I am canvassing actually these days, just to, you go around and asking people what they're thinking, and some people are expressing concern that we council members have not told them the truth about the affordable housing program because they're not seeing units. And I, of course, tell them how hard we are working, you are working. Is there anything we can do to accelerate getting units built?
If we can figure out how to do local bond financing, that will help. Just so that everybody knows, and anybody who might be listening, from the time you have the concept or idea of doing a development to the time you have certificates of occupancy and people moving in can take 3, 4, 5, 6+ years, particularly on the affordable housing side, because it takes roughly 2 years to secure all your funding, and that's assuming you've secured a site, because you have to secure your site before you can secure financing. And then it's 2 years to build, roughly, if it's new construction. So that's what takes so long. Doing acquisition would be faster, but you would theoretically, if you had enough money and could compete and had even in the acquisition, I have extra layers of approval processes. So the 16 units that we acquired, I knew the seller. The seller was willing to work with me. If I didn't know the seller for 16 tiny little units, they wouldn't have sold it to me. I had to get approvals. I had to get the funding together. I had to get approvals from my board. I had to come to city council and get approvals. So it does take longer. So you have to have someone willing to wait. And you're not adding any additional units. That's the other challenge of doing acquisition. You can theoretically preserve it as affordable, but you're not dealing with the real marketplace squeeze if you're not adding new units.
Okay, so, excuse me, so adding new units at least means that we would have fewer than 991 units lost, right? I mean, which is good, since they're going out on one side and we're trying to build them up on the other. But it sounds like, so since you do have the sites, at least the ones that you're building on for the city, there's at least that. But it's minimum 4 years and probably more to build, in part because the capital stacks are so diverse and just multiplies the regulations that you're going through.
Right. And if I could, but it'd be dumb. I could compete with myself for the same funding sources, but there's only so much out there, which is again why looking at doing bond financing with millage as not 100% of the payback, but supplementing rents would allow more funding to come in sooner than each year. Right now, the millage is about $7 million a year. Part of that goes to staffing costs, literally, to do the work that we're doing, and part of it is already going to services. One of the attachments to this presentation tonight shows the distribution of projects that have been funded, including 2 of Avalon's projects. One that's been partially built or 2/3 built, which is Hickory Way. The other is underway, which is Viridian at the County Farm Park. Catherine, 350 South Fifth, as well as the 16 units we just acquired at Liberty. Also, if we were able to have more funding sooner, we could also not just fund the projects that we're doing, but other projects that are being in the pipeline or in the concept phase or whatever it is that others are working on. Right now, the amount is so tiny that I hate to say, because I don't want to hoard funds, but I'm not even feel like I'm hoarding. I just like the gap, just filling the gap. 1 year's worth of millage money to fill the gap at Catherine was the entire year. It took a whole year's worth of millage just to fill the gap at Catherine with 12 other funding sources. It's just really challenging right now.
Yep. So just again, to make sure that I'm completely understanding, it's really bonding is the key here, because that lets you get more money sooner, just like what we've done with the roads. We're not waiting for it to come in. Okay, and Viridian has broken ground. Yeah, great.
They closed, I want to say 2 or 3 weeks ago on their financing, so they should be breaking ground. What you see out there right now is the market rate side that's broken ground and is going vertical, but the Avalon portion, they just closed on their financing, so you'll see it on their portion as well soon.
Excellent, that's great. Okay, so then my other question comes from a conversation I've been having with a resident. And I've been getting a lot of, well, not a lot, but more than one from different people, concerns about folks sleeping in parks. And so I have two questions. One is it true that Ann Arbor has enough housing accommodation to house individuals who are sleeping overnight in our parks? And would it be true year-round, or would it just be true in certain seasons? Because from what you've said tonight, I don't think it's true in the winter that we have enough housing accommodation. So that's question one, and feel free to elaborate. Question two is, some residents believe that if we have accommodation space, people should be removed from public spaces at night, whether or not they want to go. Would you have any advice on the pros and cons of such a policy?
Yeah, appreciate the question. When you say housing accommodation, you mean shelter, emergency shelter? Okay. Yeah, so as we shared earlier, in the winter months, we do have a commitment to have enough shelter accommodations for everybody. It's very basic, obviously. Like I said, we'll convert our cafeteria, we'll do anything, we'll add on sites all over the entire county. So from November, the second week in November until the end of March-ish, we'll go a little bit longer if we're able to, if we have sites. We will have enough accommodation for anybody. So street outreach we work really closely with. That's the PATH outreach team run by CMH. They'll go out and they'll talk with folks who are staying in parks and areas and work with AAPD and the sheriff's office on that as well. And when folks are identified, PATH will go out and let them know in the winter months that is readily available. However, in the non-winter months, so from April until that second week in November, we're woefully short on beds. As Amanda shared, I'm actually, that 58, I would love those 58 extra beds, although I'd really love some more housing first, but then we don't even need it. But in the non-winter months, we have a triage list on the individual's end, and that list, in typical years, it's about 40 to 60 people waiting for a bed. Another reason why we think we're gonna have a record number this winter is that's ballooned to over 100. So at this moment, we have over 100 people who are individuals that are actively experiencing homelessness who want a bed. They're checking in every week for a bed, and we're having to prioritize them. And it's a really sad process that we have to do this at all if we don't have enough beds. But what we do is we, as Amanda shared, we use the SPDAT, the Service Prioritization Decision Assistance tool, to help us look at need. Really, anybody on the street has a need, but you do, just for the sake of the lack of resources, you sort. And then if somebody has a really acute need, like, give you an example, if someone is on the streets, recently we had somebody who was trying to do cancer treatment, and the doctor wouldn't start until they had shelter. So we prioritized that person for the bed before others, and got them in for a bed. So I don't know where that information was heard, but for residents in the community, we definitely don't have enough beds.
Do you have any comment on this idea that, so during the winter months, whether or not people want to be in a shelter, ought they be required to?
I mean, I will say in the winter months, our street count, which I'm really proud of, the number is very, very low. Amanda will be able to share about 20 that we found. I do it every year. You go out, it's the third Wednesday in January. We do it in the middle of the night, like 7 to 3 a.m. I swear it's always the coldest day of the year. It's like, I don't know what the weather gods are doing or something, but it's always the coldest day. And yeah, last year was 20 people, so it is a really low number. We want to get out in the streets and actively engage with those folks. Street Outreach does a good job with that, and they work really closely with us at the shelter. In fact, our housing director was the Street Outreach lead before she came here. So they're talking all the time, but we don't require anybody to come in, because if somebody doesn't want to come in, they're just not going to come in. But I will say, with that said, we did move to a low barrier shelter model in 2018. And what that does is we don't test for drugs and alcohol when someone comes in. It's all behavior based. We still make sure it's safe. We still make sure that if somebody, if it's unsafe for themselves or others, then we find other accommodations. But as long as it's safe, we ask folks to come in. And I think since that's happened, the number of people that have been on the streets in those cold months has gone down.
Thanks. We have 2 more council members in queue and about 6 minutes left. So Councilmember Watson.
My first part of my question was pretty similar to Lisa's, but similarly, I think for Dan and Amanda, are we seeing an impact of the city's Supportive Connections program that's supposed to provide some assistance to people in downtown, direct them to services? And what other organizations are providing kind of I'd say, supportive services and mental health services for people either in shelter or staying with shelter partners, because I know that a few shelter partners have actually dropped out because of property damage or just different issues that they're having. But what services can we offer to kind of make it easier for people on these sites to access care when they're going through kind of crisis?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first question, we do work closely with Supportive Connections. One of our staff, our housing coordinator, is the liaison. I think they have a weekly meeting, where they meet, and really that's about triaging really difficult cases, as you said, council member, the folks who are really struggling, and that's often a small percentage of people that are really having a difficult time. They're going through that acute crisis. They're dealing with a whole myriad of things. Maybe it's a dual diagnosis, mental health and physical health, maybe substance use as well. So where that Supportive Connections comes in is there's a meeting, and then there's coordination between the various partners. I want to say SOS, a few other housing providers are involved in that as well as the shelter. And then I think on the end of how do we provide more wraparound supports for folks, I think it's things like that. One thing that I've talked about with Councilmember Briggs and a few other folks who've come out recently is maybe more resources for those really high need individuals, and more training for the staff that's working with them, and lower caseloads and ratios for those folks. That would be helpful. It's very resource intensive. The investment from the city, from the excise tax that's being used to support that, but further investment in that area would be incredibly helpful, because it really is it's about 20 people at a given time, maybe on the individual's end, that really need that highest level of care, and they're unfortunately getting trespassed from the shelter due to issues perhaps. Then we're letting them back in. We're low barrier, want to get them back in. We're trying to work with them, work with the partners, work really closely with CMH. A lot of petitions and hospitalizations are occurring, but we're really trying to work closely with those individuals to try to get them the support that they need.
Really appreciate that, and just appreciate all the work you're doing.
Thanks. Councilmember Harrison, you're up next, but is there general consensus that if we go a few minutes over, we'll be okay with that? All right, Councilmember Harrison.
Thank you all for being here and for all the work that you do for our community. I have a couple things. I think you might have been speaking to a little bit earlier, Ms. Hall, but the county is considering a master leasing program. I don't know if you have heard about, well, I guess you would have heard about this, right? So basically renting, building, or units, offering affordable subleasing. Is that something that would be reasonable for Ann Arbor as a stopgap until housing is built, or to mitigate evictions?
It is very hard to do master leasing. We do have, some of our nonprofits do master leasing, SOS and MAP, I think. It's a challenging model. I think if they're willing to put the resources, enough resources to it, it could be beneficial. I wouldn't recommend it for the city of Ann Arbor.
Okay.
If the county wants to do it and put resources to it, I'm happy for them to do that.
Okay. Thank you. And also want to ask about I think the Ann Arbor Housing Commission may have received a HUD grant a couple of years ago that was specifically to incentivize landlords. Can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Thank you for asking. I put a note for that too. So we were designated, we didn't get extra funding, but we're designated what's called a moving to work organization. Ignore the title, but ours was related to incentivizing landlords and helping tenants. So basically we have all kinds of flexibility. We offer landlord incentives to stay a landlord, to become a landlord. We can pay for security deposits now. We can pay for application fees. We can pay for supports. So we have a whole range of items that we used to use our nonprofit to pay for, and now we can use our HUD funds to pay for, and that's been super helpful.
Great, great, thank you. And that started, did that start?
Year and a half ago?
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you. I think that may be, well, kind of to piggyback on what Councilmember Watson was asking about in terms of, somebody who needs that smaller population that really needs that extra support. Can you speak to, I know that we appropriated some of the excise tax money, but can you kind of speak to the need of that and how, maybe, I guess I'm thinking about future budget cycles and, just.
That's a great question. I know a member of the council has proposed that. We don't have, I think part of our work is as we pilot this new effort that we're doing and continue supportive connections, we're better understanding the needs of that group and how to best serve them. Because this is folks who may have been removed from subsidized housing and we're trying to get them out of that cycle. I think we have to better understand the problem, but I think that's the plan, is to understand how to work with that group. In the end, it's going to be more training, less caseloads, deeply invested resources, and also a multi-sector support. So it's not just homelessness and housing. It's where do we bring in CMH, where do we bring in the hospital, if in Michigan Medicine and St. Joe's, if somebody's cycling in and out of the ER. Where do we bring in the substance use providers? That's often an important piece too, Home and Vision or Dawn Farms. So I hope we can get more answers on that soon, but I think in general it'll be just how do we get more staff working in that. And one thing at the shelter we just launched was a mental health coordinator role that is at the center of that as well. But it's just now kicking off, so we want to give it some time to see the efficacy of the program and what the other needs are.
Okay, and I meant to mention, more trauma-informed case management.
Definitely
Right.
trauma-informed, and we want it to be more training for the community around trauma-informed care and harm reduction.
Yeah.
And how do we support folks and also not re-traumatize them when they're going through this horrible crisis. Because at the shelter, one of our team members will talk about it as like the Pareto principle on steroids. It's not even the 80-20 rule, it's the 95-5 rule. You have 5% of people that really are having the most challenges and really need that higher level of support to really get them back on their feet. So yeah, it has to be trauma-informed. It has to be use motivational interviewing and make sure you strongly train the team.
And I like the educating the community, because we want to keep people from going to jail right? And we, I think educating the community around stigma and, just, I think that's very important, right? So.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you.
Totally agree.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to ask one really quick question, but I don't mean to put you on the spot. I think this is for you, Ms. Hall. But if you would actually just maybe commit to following back up with us, one of the challenges that you mentioned, a number of the challenges you mentioned are a little outside of our scope and broader to kind of the development market in general. But one of the things that you mentioned was some of the city codes and city fees and the regulatory environment that we do have some control over. And I wonder if maybe you could follow back up with some of the specific challenges that you face that we might want to consider as we continue with our work in policymaking in the future to the extent that we can maybe ease some of those burdens.
And I know Heather Seiferth was working with John Fournier on coming up with a recommendation, so I can check back with him. I know she interviewed myself and others and put together a draft of that.
Thank you.
Yep.
One final thought from
So
Councilmember
sorry.
Song.
For our affordable housing millage, there was a cap of 20% going towards supportive services. I'm wondering, the Housing Commission had released this amazing report last year saying that we beat the national average in being able to house folks for a year or longer, 97%, right, who are formerly unhoused. And the national average is 86%. If we uncap that 20% and leave it to, I don't know, changing needs, changing environment, more folks who are needing emergency housing. Would that be something that would be helpful to you? Because I wasn't on council when this cap was, was I on council when this cap was? I can't remember anything. It was the summer before. Okay.
I can talk, I know, we
Yeah.
have just a few minutes. Right now, less than 10% is used for services, and that's okay in that you need the housing to be built first, and so it's going to be heavier, more than 20% towards the end of this millage and much less at the front. So I think we haven't gotten far enough in to kind of understand what the needs will be yet. I would rather see a countywide mental health millage additional re-upped in a year or two, whenever it is, to be towards services myself.
Thanks, all three of you, for being here and for answering questions for us. We now come to public comment general time, an opportunity for members of the public to address council. You don't need to have signed up in advance, but if there is anyone here for public comment, please feel free to approach the podium. Seeing no one in-house jumping at the opportunity, do we have anyone online who would like to address council?
We do, Mayor. Jeff Hayner, did you have a comment? Press *6 to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm not sure this is me, maybe it's me.
Go ahead.
Yeah, hi there. Hi, my name's Jeff Hayner, Ward 1. Boy, there's a lot to say about this topic. I always like to see Jen's presentation, Ms. Hall's presentation. Some things jump out of it, of course, like when we say most of our vouchers are not utilized in Ann Arbor. I mean, it's an odd twist there that we're funding them, but the people are living elsewhere. That's okay. That's what need be. It really, planning for the unhoused should be a regional matter, of course. The biggest question I get when I talk to neighbors is, how did it come to be that the first year's receipts from the millage at $6 million plus basically bought a piece of property that the city already owned? And of course, I heard the explanation, but most people don't understand that financial transacting that went on there and feel like it was a major setback for that fund. I see the mayor's not here, and he should be ashamed to be there. And so, because since he has touched Ann Arbor politics, the percentage of affordable housing that has been available in our community has gone down. It goes down year after year after year. And I have long advocated for looking at our needs for housing as a percentage of the whole. And I think if we did that, we'd see really how far in the hole we are when it comes to affordable housing. And Ms. Hall also knows that I was stonewalled when I tried to get the city to drop the various fees that we charge our housing commission for building new properties. I will be shocked if we do any inclusionary zoning, because there's been no indication that this council is interested in that in TC1 and all the other zoning changes that are being rushed in under the reconsideration of our comprehensive land use plan. I'm also disappointed to hear that there may be moving forward. I think we did some good, and Ms. Hall even said it, when we asked her to evaluate the various city-owned properties for affordable housing, and now we're looking at selling the Klein's lot to some kind of conference center in a backroom deal, and that's no good. The one thing I was disappointed, well, many things, but one thing I was disappointed was to see the consideration that NIMBYism is somehow holds up the quest for affordable housing. I mean, the fact that we now have a millage, that our taxes went up and we're all paying for that, speaks the opposite of that. And honestly, the biggest advocacies that I have seen in the last couple of years has been to get more inclusionary zoning, and we need look no further than the $9 million that we left on the table with the Lower Town deal by giving them favorable zoning. And so I think we need to lose that pejorative term in the future. I guess one last thing I would say is a lot of our social service money, in fact, I think the majority of it goes to Avalon. And I know there's some concerns about social services, and you even mentioned how the insurance goes. Your fire insurance went up because of the fire at Miller Manor. And, Avalon has an abolitionist stance towards our police, and I believe that any social service agencies that get money from the city need to work with the city.
Thank you. That's time. Do we have any other speakers?
Mayor Pro Tem, I don't see any other callers on the line with their hands up.
All right. Seeing no other callers, public comment is closed. Do we have any communications from council? Councilmember Briggs.
Since we ran out of question time earlier, I'll just put this in the form of a comment, which was, I want to thank you for being here, for providing this information, for giving us a strong foundation to be able to work from and also to present back to the community. And also, based on some of the follow-up questions to some of mine, I just want to make sure it's clear that I am very proud of the support that the Ann Arbor community is placing and investing in affordable housing. There is a lot of, and as far as I'm aware, we're the only local government in Washtenaw County and perhaps Monroe County as well that is investing this level of resource into affordable housing. And so given the financing needs for this, it would be great to see more communities coming to the table to help support the great need. But I'm glad that we are building the housing here, and that so much of it is in the Fifth Ward. It's good. Thanks.
Any other council member comments? Seeing none, I think that we are adjourned.